Most people don't think of clouds of asbestos when they picture a small mountain, no town in Montana, but that's exactly what happened in Libby. A place that looked quiet and peaceful on the outside, but underneath the surface was hiding one of the worst environmental disasters in American history. This wasn't just some factory spill or short-term issue. What happened in Libby stretched across decades, poisoned the air, the soil, and even the water, and changed thousands of lives forever. It all started back in the early 1900s, when settlers arrived in the area. The mountains surrounding Libby were rich with minerals, and the discovery of a shiny, flaky mineral called vermiculite in the year 1919 quickly turned Libby into a busy mining town. Vermiculite might not sound exciting, but it was a big deal. When heated, it expanded and became light and fluffy, making it perfect for everything from insulation to soil conditioners, even packaging material. By the time the 1960s rolled around, Libby's mine was producing around 80% of the world's vermiculite, but there was a hidden danger buried in that shiny mineral. Mixed in with the vermiculite was a naturally occurring and deadly form of asbestos known as tremolite actinolite. Now, asbestos isn't dangerous when it's untouched, but once it's disturbed, like it would be in a mine, the tiny fibers become airborne. If those fibers get into the lungs, they can cause serious illnesses like asbestosis, lung cancer, and a rare but aggressive cancer called mesothelioma. The thing is, these diseases don't show up right away. It can take decades for symptoms to appear, which made it even harder for people to understand what was happening to them. In the early years, people in Libby had no idea they were breathing in anything dangerous. They just knew there was always a lot of dust. The mine sat just outside town, and that dust would drift into the streets, homes, schools, and playgrounds. Workers came home from long shifts with their clothes and skin coated in gray powder, hugging their families and spreading asbestos fibers unknowingly. Children played on contaminated fields, and some families even used leftover vermiculite from the mine for landscaping or insulation. Nobody warned them. Nobody told them the truth. The company that first mined vermiculite in Libby was Zonolite. They had started operations in the 1920s and kept growing bigger. But by the year 1963, a larger company called W.R. Grace & Company had taken over, and that's when the real tragedy started to unfold. By then, workers were already getting sick. Internal reports from as early as the mid-1960s showed that the company was tracking employee health issues. One report even listed names of employees with abnormal chests, a quiet way of noting severe lung problems. Many of those workers would later die of lung disease. Despite all this, nothing was done. The mine kept operating. People in town kept living with the dust. And even when someone got suspicious and asked questions about the so-called dust disease, they were usually brushed off. Some were told the mine only had tremolite, not realizing that tremolite was one of the deadliest forms of asbestos. One miner even remembered feeling completely blindsided when he found that out, saying, "We're not geologists. Nobody up on that hill knew what tremolite meant." The truth stayed buried for decades, and while the mine finally shut down in the year 1990, the damage had already been done. By the late 1990s, an alarming number of people in Libby were getting sick, and local doctors started raising red flags. The town that once prided itself on hard work and natural beauty was now dealing with a full-blown health crisis, and that was just the beginning. As the years went by in Libby, Montana, life seemed to carry on like normal, but behind the quiet mountain town charm, a deadly threat was growing stronger every day. It wasn't just the miners who were breathing in dangerous asbestos dust. It was their families, neighbors, and anyone who lived nearby. As the mining trucks moved back and forth from the hills, a fine powdery dust blew through the streets, coated homes, and settled in yards. People walked through it, kids played in it, and no one realized just how toxic it really was. By the early 1960s, the mine in Libby was producing over 80% of the world's supply of vermiculite. The mineral was everywhere, used in homes, gardens, and buildings across the country. But this particular source of vermiculite had a hidden contaminant, tremolite actinolite, one of the most toxic forms of asbestos. Inhaling just a tiny amount of it could eventually cause serious illness, but that wasn't common knowledge at the time. Most residents thought the dust was just part of life in a mining town. Even worse, mine waste was often handed out to the public for free. It was used to line driveways, fill potholes, build playgrounds, and even as soil in community gardens. People thought it was a useful resource, never suspecting it was full of deadly asbestos fibers. Kids slid down piles of the dusty waste after school. Local businesses unknowingly tracked it inside on their shoes. Churches, schools, and backyards were built on top of contaminated land. As time passed, more and more people in Libby started to feel sick. The illnesses didn't hit right away. Sometimes it took decades for symptoms to show up. Many residents experienced shortness of breath, constant coughing, or unexplained fatigue. Some were diagnosed with rare diseases like mesothelioma or asbestosis, which are directly linked to asbestos exposure. And these weren't just old miners nearing retirement. Many were young, healthy people who had never stepped foot in the mine. Doctors in town began noticing patterns. Lung issues were popping up in people who had no other risk factors. Families were losing loved ones without understanding why. By the time most people got a diagnosis, there was little anyone could do to stop the damage. And still, no official warnings were issued to the public. For decades, there were no signs posted around town, no public announcements, no testing. People continued living, working, and raising families in an environment that was slowly poisoning them. And although there were hints that the company behind the mine, W.R. Grace & Company, was aware of the risks, they continued to keep quiet. Internal reports dating back to the mid-1960s mentioned abnormal chest x-rays in workers and rising concerns about lung disease, but nothing was shared with the public. It wasn't just about sickness. The emotional toll was massive. Families lost mothers, fathers, siblings, and children. Entire households were affected. People who had trusted their community's main employer now felt betrayed. They had been left in the dark for too long, and by the time help arrived, the damage had already spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Still, the full extent of the disaster hadn't come to light. At this point in the story, the town of Libby was dealing with growing health problems, a rising number of unexplained deaths, and no real answers from those in charge. But the worst part? Most of the country had never even heard of it. The story of Libby was about to change, just not in the way residents had hoped. In the late 1990s, the town of Libby was still suffering in silence. Decades had passed since the mine first opened, and by now, hundreds of people had either fallen ill or passed away. Yet outside of Montana, hardly anyone knew the town existed, let alone the slow-motion disaster happening there. That changed when a Seattle-based journalist named Andrew Schneider received a tip from a source about a small town dealing with a strange cluster of lung diseases. Schneider began digging. What he found shocked him. Medical records, internal company memos, and reports from former employees pointed to a major health crisis tied directly to asbestos exposure. In November of the year 2000, he published a series of articles in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer that exposed what had been hidden for so long. The headlines were blunt, the facts were horrifying, and finally the outside world was paying attention. The Environmental Protection Agency responded quickly. Within weeks, a team of EPA investigators arrived in Libby to begin testing soil, air, and even the insulation in homes. What they found confirmed Schneider's reporting: widespread contamination throughout the town. Even places that had no direct link to the mining site were testing positive for deadly asbestos fibers. This discovery led to one of the most aggressive environmental cleanup operations in U.S. history. The EPA declared Libby a public health emergency in the year 2009, the first time in its history that such a declaration was made for a single town. By then, thousands of residents had been exposed to dangerous levels of asbestos for decades. At the center of the crisis stood W.R. Grace & Company. As the owner of the mine, the company had long claimed it operated within the law, but internal documents now uncovered told a different story. Memos from as far back as the early 1970s mentioned concerns over dust levels, rising medical costs, and worker health problems. Some records even suggested efforts to downplay the risks or keep information from reaching the public. One of the most powerful voices to come forward during this time was a former mine manager named Robert Locke. He admitted under oath that he had been instructed to withhold certain safety information and had helped the company avoid drawing attention to the health hazards. His testimony became a key piece in the case that followed. In the year 2005, the United States Department of Justice indicted 7 current and former executives from W.R. Grace & Company. They were charged with conspiracy, fraud, and knowing endangerment. Prosecutors argued that the company had placed profits above lives, choosing silence over responsibility. The trial became a major national news story. People across the country were finally hearing the name Libby and understanding just how long its residents had suffered. Despite all the evidence and emotional testimony, the outcome of the trial surprised many. In the year 2009, all 7 individuals were acquitted of criminal charges. The jury found that the government had failed to prove that the men knowingly put lives at risk. While the legal case was over, the public outrage continued. For the people of Libby, the verdict felt like a second betrayal. But the exposure of the disaster had changed things. Federal aid began flowing into the town, medical screenings were expanded, cleanup crews were sent to remove contaminated insulation from homes, schools, and public buildings. And perhaps most importantly, the story of Libby forced a national conversation about the dangers of asbestos and the importance of environmental oversight. The damage, however, was already done. The physical toll couldn't be reversed, families had lost too much, and even as cleanup efforts began, residents had to live with the knowledge that their town would never be the same. After the criminal trial ended in the year 2009, the people of Libby were left to deal with the aftermath. While the verdict had disappointed many, the town's fight for justice wasn't over. Libby was now the focus of one of the largest and longest-running environmental cleanup efforts ever carried out by the United States government. Over the next decade, the Environmental Protection Agency worked to decontaminate schools, homes, parks, and businesses. Specialized crews removed tons of asbestos-contaminated soil, tore out old insulation, and replaced it with safer materials. It was a massive operation that took years, and it was only possible because the town had finally been heard. In addition to the physical cleanup, the federal government took a rare step. Congress passed legislation that gave Libby residents access to long-term health care. Under the Affordable Care Act, a special provision was added specifically for victims of the asbestos exposure in Libby. This made them eligible for federal benefits to help with medical costs, including treatment for asbestos-related diseases. It was a small but significant win for the community, proof that their voices had finally reached Washington. A local clinic, the Center for Asbestos-Related Disease, or CARD, became a lifeline for many families. Doctors there specialized in diagnosing and treating asbestos illnesses. They also helped gather data to better understand the long-term effects of the contamination. What they found was heartbreaking. People who had never worked in the mine, including children and spouses of miners, continued to show signs of illness. In some cases, the asbestos exposure came just from playing in a backyard or handling clothes covered in dust. These stories showed how far the contamination had spread and how deeply it had affected the town. Despite the progress, Libby faced another challenge: its identity. For years, the town had been defined by what happened there. News reports, documentaries, and books told the story of a place poisoned by asbestos. Tourism dropped, property values fell. Some residents moved away to escape the constant reminder of what had been lost, but others chose to stay and rebuild. They planted new gardens, restored old buildings, and created events to bring the community together again. Slowly, Libby began to shift from a story of tragedy to one of resilience. The local high school started teaching students about what had happened, not to dwell on the pain, but to ensure it was never forgotten. Public art projects were launched to honor the victims. One mural downtown shows a family standing strong together, surrounded by trees and mountains. It's a symbol of what Libby had endured and what it continues to overcome. Today, Libby is still recovering. Some places remain off limits due to lingering contamination, and for many, the health problems remain, but the town is no longer silent. It has become a case study for environmental justice, a reminder of what happens when profit is valued over safety and what it takes to fight back. The legacy of Libby lives on in court rulings, environmental policies, and medical research. It also lives on in the strength of its people. Their voices, once ignored, changed the law, forced government action, and brought national attention to an invisible killer. Libby's story is a hard one. It is full of loss, anger, and unanswered questions, but it is also a story of courage, of a small town that refused to be forgotten.